Welcome to the Branford Eagle, the public access cable television version of our town's online community newspaper. We cover the current issues of the day. We are part of the NewHavenIndependent.org website, our area's online newspaper. Our online journalism project is designed to give readers news, analysis, and opinion, especially as newspapers as we have known them face difficulty surviving. You can read the Branford Eagle by going to NewHavenIndependent.org's website or Googling us. Today we are delighted to have with us Board of Finance member Kurt Schwanfelder. Kurt has served Branford on numerous boards and commissions for about 30 years. And he's held positions as minority and majority leader of the Representative Town Meeting, as well as serving as a member of the Police Commissioners Board. Open Space Commission as well, do I recall correctly?
That's
the
correct.
Board of Assessment and Appeals?
Correct.
Okay. I don't think I've left any out, but...
Charter Revision.
Charter Revision, okay. And yes, in the past, he ran with former First Selectman John Opie.
That's correct.
For a seat on the Board of Selectmen. And he sought the endorsement of the Republican Town Committee for First Selectman this very year.
Correct.
And now here he is. And the reason that he's here is that we have just learned that he is supporting Andy Campbell, the Democratic candidate for First Selectman. He is still a registered Republican, but we wanted to know why he decided to change his mind in terms of his support. So we invited him to our show today to ask him about his Campbell endorsement, not an everyday event in an election year. So welcome, Kurt, to the Branford Eagle
Thank
Show.
you for having me.
You're welcome. And we'd like to know what went into your decision to support Campbell instead of Jamie Cosgrove for First Selectman in the upcoming election, which, by the way, will be on November 5th.
Well, briefly, I've worked with Andy Campbell for many years. When I was on the RTM, he was in the Democratic aisle. I was on the Republican aisle. We worked very closely with each other. And the very fortunate thing that we had was in those times we were able to actually be moderate enough that we would be able to see each other's viewpoints and come to a conclusion that we could move legislation forward. For that reason and a number of others, I feel that Andy has probably the best qualifications to be one of our, to be our next selectman for the town of Branford.
Yeah, and he certainly has the experience because he's been involved in Branford government for 20 years in different roles.
That's correct.
Jamie has less experience than that. But what specifically about the Cosgrove candidacy concerns you?
Well, I think we fall back to what I've just expressed, and I even had this conversation with with Jamie Cosgrove. I discussed it with him when he and I were both looking for the nomination from the Republican Party, and I told him expressly that I felt that he was a fine young man. I didn't see any issues with him, yet he had only spent 2 years on the RTM and had spent 1.5 years as a selectman. And it was one of those where we are, in the town of Branford, I will say the word we are a $100 million corporation. It takes over almost $100 million to run the town of Branford. And the person who sits in the front office, a lot of people think is a chief executive officer. That's incorrect. The person who sits there is a chief operating officer, is a COO. And of a $100 million corporation, to vote somebody in with a popular vote versus an experienced vote, I feel, is something that should not be done. People who are going to be the leaders of this town should have the experience base and the knowledge to understand in a rounded form what it takes to operate a $100 million corporation.
So have you worked within the Democratic Party, and is one of your
No,
goals?
I don't work with the Democratic Party. I don't work with parties. To be very frank with you, in today's world, the designation between Republican and Democrat, I don't even think many people even care about, to be very honest with you.
Right.
I think if you were to look at most of the lawn signs that have been put out in the up-and-coming election and the rest, nobody touts an allegiance to a party. I haven't seen the word Democrat or Republican put on either.
That's an interesting.
So, to be very frank with you, I think it's one to tag somebody with a Republican or a Democratic mark and the rest. Really, it's not correct. I think you have a lot of independent people in town here, myself included, who are intelligent individuals who can look through whatever the situation may be, whatever the problem may be, and the rest, and try and find the best solution to it.
But are you actively reaching out to, say, disaffected Republicans? Because one of your earlier themes that you have voiced is that you didn't leave the Republican Party, the party left you.
That's absolutely correct.
Right. And what, explain to our viewers.
Well, we have factions in town here that are not too unsimilar to what there is on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. right now. I see in both camps, the Democrats and Republicans, to use the tag form, in the town of Branford now, people who have gone, in my estimation, too far, have gone extremely right or extremely left. Whether you become extremely conservative or extremely liberal, that's not going to work for us. It's not going to work for us at all. We need to still stay moderate, and we still need to stay moving forward.
Yes. Well, one of the, I mean, that's to be desired, but that obviously hasn't happened.
Well, there's still parties that are named, but if you look at the characters in each one of the parties, both Democrat and Republican in town, the members have basically gone back and forth numerous times. If you look at the present Republican camp, it's mostly now the older, the years past, very ultra-conservative Democrats that were basically taken out of their own party, formed the taxpayer party.
Right, right.
And then what happened is that basically fell to the wayside. Now what's happened is it's resurfaced in the Republican Party.
Well, but in terms of the history of the taxpayer party, it was Jamie's grandfather.
That's correct.
Could you tell us about Dan Cosgrove a little bit and the taxpayers party?
Oh, goodness.
Well, not a lot, but just explain to the viewer that whole circumference, because Danny was a Democrat until he became.
Well, Danny
he was,
Cosgrove Sr. Became a Democrat. By true definition, he's been a conservative Republican most of his life.
Right. Well, he's now 96.
Yeah, but being the businessman that he has been and the rest, his model of what he does and the rest follows a conservative Republican. He basically tied into the Democrats in the late 50s and early 60s because the town itself was very Democratic, and it worked to his advantage.
Right.
So that's where that came from, and they reigned. The Democratic Party at that time reigned for well over 20 years. I think it was 20 to 22 years that they stayed in power, and that basically just went to the wayside because it became too conservative.
Right. It became too conservative. And do you think now that the current Republican Party is of that philosophy and that Jamie adheres to it?
Well, my feeling is that's a lot what has happened. Yes, it has become similar to what there is of the National Republican Party.
One of the topics of the debate last night was the discussion of a creation of a permanent building commission or committee, and which, if I recall correctly, was an idea that you had a while back. And tell us about what happened to that committee and what you project in terms of, you're also on the Board of Finance now, so I think the Board of Finance is sort of kind of taking an overview of the whole process of how we fund, how the town funds these buildings. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Well, we're on the precipice in town here of looking at a numerous amount of different requests for facilities. You have Public Works, which is presently looking for and needing a new facility. You have seniors who are looking at the possible need for a new facility. You have the education department that's looking for new facilities. There's always something that's on the horizon for requests for new facilities. Historically, approximately, I'd say close to about 10 years ago, when I was still on the RTM, myself and a counterpart on the Democratic side got together, and 2 departments were created at that time in town. One was the IT, which was information technology, and the other one was GGB, which was general government buildings. The IT was developed by one other person, and GGB was developed by me. GGB was to be a department that managed and operated all of the facilities that we have in town. Prior to having that, what there was is every one of the department heads who were housed in a facility were the ones who were responsible for the maintenance and operations and upkeep of their buildings. I thought that to be a very, very difficult thing to task a department head with. They're supposed to be focused on what their services that they're supposed to provide, and trying to operate, maintain, and keep up an entire facility on top of providing the services they're supposed to me just seemed to be far more to ask of a department head than they truly should have. Plus, what it was doing is it was costing us a tremendous amount, because what was happening is each department became its own little fiefdom. And what was happening is having multiples, having 10, 12, 16 departments in multiple buildings around town, there was no uniformity to what was being done as far as maintenance and operations and everything of each facility. So what was happening is we were not just having redundancies, we were having multiples times 10, 12, 16, which was really ludicrous. So looking into streamlining things and the rest, GGB became an idea that I sat down and said, this is something we should implement, because in the long run it will help cost, it will help operations, it will keep everything in line the way it should. We invest in our building and properties in town here. We need to maintain and operate them correctly.
So, did you discuss this with the Republican Town Committee at any point?
Well, what there was is this is something that the skeleton of GGB has been implemented, but it has never been truly brought about by any of the past and present administrations.
So, and why wouldn't they want to streamline it?
I don't know. I truly don't know why they did. I mean, they embraced IT, the information technology, but they did not embrace general government buildings.
So both of these candidates seem to feel that they might generate a committee or a commission were they to be elected.
That's correct. But the thing is, what I had devised initially with GGB is that it was to have its own standing building committee built into it, so the department had that capability internally all the time.
Right, okay.
So there was no need to go out and keep creating a committee for every time.
Every single time, yes.
Every single time you had something that was standing there all the time.
And now, you know, there have been accusations, at least on the Republican end, against the way in which the last building committee was put together, that it was too political because there was an attorney who's on the Democratic Town Committee. But you wonder if that's a valid interpretation, since, you know, we have attorneys sitting on many committees, right?
I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to say one attorney can do it and one can't?
Yeah,
I mean, that's
right. And if you look at the RTM on the Republican side, there are 4 attorneys right now. Are we going to say to them that they shouldn't serve because, you know, they happen to be members of the RTC? I mean, it does make for an interesting set of arguments, but they're not necessarily valid.
No, they're not valid at all.
The other thing that came up at the at the debate last night was a discussion about town council and whether or not there should be a new way of looking at town council. What's your view
absolutely,
about that?
there should be a new way to look at town council, and that dovetails into 2 things that I would really like to see the town embrace. Town council is something that should not be politically motivated. It should not be politically tied to an administration and turn with it every time there's a turn of administrations. What will be necessary with that is, along with how we change council, is that we should have a full-time standing charter revision commission. And that's something that should stay throughout every administration. It should transcend and it should stay in place permanently.
Well, you know, in this election, the words charter revision has not come up at all by either candidate.
They won't touch it.
And why won't they?
They won't touch it. They'll talk about it, but nobody wants to touch charter revision, because if you do anything in charter revision, what happens as a selectman is voted in and finds that there's a certain power base that comes along with it. If
it comes along with the position.
Comes along with the administrative position. If they get into charter revision, and if any form of government is changed to any extent in the rest of that, it can alter the power base. So in most cases, you're going to find people that once they come into office, they're not going to challenge that at all. I think it would be a very brave individual who would be able to come into town hall and say, this is the type of situation where I'm not saying we move to a city council type government or something, but what we need to do is we need to revise the charter as it stands. Our charter is very old. There are very many parts of our charter that no longer are applicable. You asked about council. Council, in my estimation, should be something that should be no different than having a town engineer or our finance director or something else like that. It should be someone who is hired on, someone who is a town employee, someone who is paid a fixed amount of money on an annual basis and takes care of the daily legals that are necessary for the operation of the town of Branford. When it becomes necessary for us to get involved with anything else that's further than just the daily things, whether it be litigation or whether it be anything else further on than that, then we get the specific attorney that's necessary. But in a good corporation, we have a phenomenal finance director in town here. We should have the same thing as far as council is concerned.
Finch, yes. Well, you were on the Charter Revision Commission back in 2005.
I think it was, yes.
2005.
Yes.
And it was also about the time of an election, and Cheryl Morris came in as the first selectwoman, if I recall.
Correct.
And very early on, there was discussion about your findings and about the committee. Could you take us back to that time and tell us what happened?
That particular committee had an incredible consist to it. There was a covering of everybody in town that you could imagine. We had people sitting that were Democrats, ardent Republicans, independents. We had all sorts. And we all got along phenomenally, and we all sat down and studied the charter at great length.
And this is the charter that was adopted, I think, in
back in 59, I think it was.
59 or 60.
Yeah, it was somewhere in that area.
Right. Where we're just to let the viewer know, instead of having a town meeting once a year, you had representative people. That was one thing that came out of it. The major thing was the creation of the RTM.
That's correct.
And we're one of maybe 10 towns that has.
I don't know how many there are in the state.
But there aren't that many.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you got together and you discussed
Well,
things.
we spent a fair amount of time on it, and the rest.
How long do you think you spent?
Oh, I'd have to say we probably spent maybe a year and a half.
Oh, that's a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we came out with, I think there were 3 or 4 recommendations. And it was very difficult to do, because every time we thought of something that we wanted to do to change the charter, it had an effect on the next item, which had an effect on the next item. It had a domino effect to it. And that's why it became very poignant to me that it's necessary to have a Charter Revision Commission that stays in place for a long period of time. Because as you try and move one item and adjust one item that's in the charter, it has an effect, multiple effects on other items in the charter. So what happens is it would take quite a while for you to be able to do things. And the thing is, as you move along small parts of the charter, we looked at, one of the items was to remove the position of the tax collector and the town clerk from elected officials. That was one of the items. We looked at changing the numerical amount of an interdepartmental transfer from, I think it was somewhere in the area of around $500 or $1,000 up to $5,000, considering the fact that we have department heads who we pay considerable amount of money to and trust them that they run the departments correctly. We should not feel that we should micromanage them to the point where they need to come to the Board of Finance and to the RTM for small, less than $500 transfers.
Right.
I mean, that just, in today's world, doesn't work.
Right.
It might have been the case back in the late 50s and early 60s, but no longer.
So what happened when you presented your report back in 2005?
Well, that was a tough one. That was a very tough one
Could you
because we presented our report to the administration and they
So
wouldn't.
this was Cheryl Morris?
Cheryl Morris and Ed Marcus.
Okay, now let's explain that here. Ed Marcus was the town attorney.
Town attorney.
Okay.
And they took the findings that we had, and I don't even know whether they read them or not, and they took them and put them directly in the round file.
In the
that's-
waste paper basket.
That's exactly where they went.
And did they give you an explanation after a year and a
They
half? of
told
work?
us that we were disbanded and that we were not necessary and that we were not legally formed and the rest. And we basically ignored what they had to say and we proceeded on until we came up with our findings.
Oh, that's
And-
right. I remember. They tried to stop you before you finished.
Correct.
So you continued anyway, and then when you finished, it went nowhere.
Absolutely. To the dismay of all of us who sat there.
Yes, from both parties.
That's correct.
Obviously, regardless of the party. Right. Well, that was also a time when Cheryl Morris was advocating eliminating the RTM.
Correct. They were looking at going to a mayoral-based town government is what they were looking at.
Do you think that might come up again in this election?
It may.
How do you
It may,
feel?
but I doubt very highly, again, that will go back to the reference that I made, that once somebody gets in office and understands what there is in office, they're not going to look at changing.
So they might want to just keep it the way it is.
It's normally what happens.
Yeah, it's normally what happens. Right. Okay.
There's a fair amount of talk before an election, but the true reality is after an election, what actually happens.
Right. One of the other things that items that came up last night was the Tabor property and where to place the Public Works building. Do you have any views on that? It's still up in the air, sort of. Maybe Ivy Street they'll go back to. Andy suggested that. Andy Campbell suggested that. Jamie Cosgrove suggested, maybe another place is yet to be determined. Tabor seems to be taken off the list of places where it could go. What's your view about the Tabor situation?
Well, Tabor's a very, very old, long, very sore subject, to be very frank.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah, it's not a very pleasant one, and it goes back not just in the time that we've been involved with it for the last 10 or 12 years. This goes back decades, decades and decades and decades. And I'm hoping that people thoroughly understand that the reason that Tabor, that parcel of property, the 77 acres, is the way it is because Jamie's grandfather is the one who dug that hole. He literally excavated every last piece of usable material from that property and left it the site that it was.
And the site that it was, Danny once told me, was so flat you could land a plane on it. And that was because there was no soil?
That's exactly. They took it to bedrock. And it had a name for the longest time for all of us who lived here. It had a name. It was called the Pit.
The Pit, right.
It was the Pit.
Why did he do that?
He could.
He could, okay. And he could obviously earn income from that.
He did.
Yes, right. And then he tried to sell it.
Well, there was numerous things that happened afterwards, but it stayed in its derelict condition for years and years and years until what happened was the Parati in Santa Barbara bought it with the...
And they ran the landfill.
They ran the landfill.
That was adjacent to this 77
That's correct.
acres.
And their hopes were to expand the landfill into that area. But in the early 90s, DEP capped all landfills. So they were left with a parcel of property, and thus started the whole debacle of what happened with Tabor.
So basically the land, which was, I believe, Danny sold it, Danny Cosgrove sold it maybe in early 1980s, or in that.
Somewhere in that area, yeah.
But at that time to now, it's never, it is what it is because of how it was left.
That's correct.
Is that essentially
That's
the problem?
correct, absolutely.
So that whatever happens, you have to restore the soil.
Well, that's part of the problem why, as far as I'm concerned, putting public works down there is an absolutely poorest idea you could ever use for the property.
Right, you would have rejected that idea initially.
I would have rejected that immediately.
Right.
Would never have put public works down there.
Right.
The residents of that area had endured enough with the landfill for all of the years that was there, and endured enough with the basically Tabor property, the pit, being the wasteland that it was and still is.
Still is, yes.
And still is in the rest.
Was the reasoning because the town owned the property and therefore it would be cheaper?
That might be a premise, but that's not the case, because if you go back into the trial case when New England Estates was looking to build on that property.
And what they wanted to build, just for the viewers to understand, was about 350 condos.
Correct.
Yeah.
The problem that there was, the pro forma that New England Estates was to provide to their lending institution as to showing the profitability of this parcel had nothing in it about remediation of the property. And when I say remediation, I don't mean about cleaning up waste. I'm talking about replacing material that was taken from that property to the point where you could be able to build upon it and have it be of a quality. The problem you have right now is that parcel has been scaved down to nothing but bedrock. So to try and build on it and have to blast into the bedrock to put the utilities and everything else that's necessary under whatever it is you propose to build is absurd. The thing you'd have to do is you would have to refill that hole down in there to the extent. The last time I did calculations with our town engineer, Steve Dudley, years ago, we calculated it was well over 500,000 cubic yards of material it would take to fill that back in to the point where you would have a good enough base to build anything upon. And that brings out, for even us as the town who own the property, we would still have to do the exact same thing.
Got it. Okay, so I think our time, this is fascinating, and I'm glad that you gave this historical overview of Tabor, because I don't think too many people understand how it got that way and what it's going to take
to put it back
to life. And so it looks like our time is up. And it really goes fast when you have really interesting topics to talk about. So I want to thank Kurt Schwanfelder for appearing on the Branford Eagle's television show today. We will have you back as the year unfolds, because you have great knowledge about the town. And again, our thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
You can read the Branford Eagle on the newhavenindependent.org website, and thank you for watching.